You would probably think Cabernet Sauvignon would want to grow in a warm, dry environment like a Napa Valley. So why is the most prestigious region of the world of Cabernet Sauvignon in one of the more rainy parts of Europe, North France? Let's find out. We're going to study it the way a master sommelier studies it. Welcome to Sommelier in Progress. This is a series where I show you how I study in depth on my way to the advanced level of the Court of Master Sommeliers. Now, let's have a look where Bordeaux all started. Started thousands of years ago with the Romans, who already planted vineyards around the city. I think it was called Bordigala, to supply their soldiers of wine. Now, fast forward a couple hundred years ago, where it was already making wine, especially in the Grave region, more south, until the Dutch. The people from the Netherlands, they were very good with water. Look at their dikes and everything. They have half of their country underneath the sea level. So they came to Bordeaux and they drained half of Bordeaux basically. And what happened is you have these beautiful regions with this very specific gravel and clay and limestone based soil, especially gravel, since that was underwater first. Important in Bordeaux is the water, and it starts all with the Gironde estuary, with the Dordogne, Garonne and the Ciron, where the Ciron is more down south near Sauternes, and the Dordogne is more on the northern side with the right bank wines. Now, looking at the history, we had Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was ruling the Bordeaux part back in the day, around 1100s. She married first an English guy, Henry, who became the King of England. So suddenly Bordeaux was under English control. And this is where the English obsession with Bordeaux wine, at that moment called Claret, a more light red wine, started out, because all this wine of course got exported to England. And this is how Bordeaux started to explode. After that, looking later on in history, the Dutch drained the marshes, what I said before. Now, what is so important about Bordeaux? Let's look at the climate first. It started as a cool maritime climate, but by now it's a lot more moderate, but still a maritime climate, because you have the Atlantic Sea, which tempers the macroclimate, basically. Think of it as a giant AC, air conditioning unit in summer, because water always warms up and cools down much slower than land. So when it is summer, it still has the coolness from winter in it. So it blows wind, which cools down the vineyards in Bordeaux. It's still a little bit warm from the summer temperature, so it warms up, or it makes it less cold, the vineyards, in the winter. This is very important, since the climate in Bordeaux is quite variable, let's say. Next to that, the rivers and the estuary like Gironde, Garonne, Dordogne, Ciron, they are moderating more on the microclimate level, so they're more moderating on the day-to-day basis instead of the seasonality based climate, because they have the same influence but just less on the macro spectrum. So during the night, the Gironde and the Garonne and the Dordogne, they make sure the vineyards are a little bit warmer because of the leftover day temperatures in the water. Same as the other way around. During the day, it cools the vineyards a little bit down, especially in winter, because you have this temperature. So all in all, water, major bodies of water, temper climate, major and macro climates. But don't forget about the land influence. In the Bordeaux, on the west side, there's the Landes forest. Because of course the Atlantic Ocean is good for the vineyards, because it moderates the macroclimate. However, it is a very wild, natural occurrence. It can give storms and winds and everything else. So the natural forest of Landes protects the Bordeaux as well from the intensity of the ocean. which is also very important to remember. Tying all of this together is very interesting because, as you may know, there are two major grapes. Of course, there are more grapes, but there are two major grapes in the Bordeaux. You have Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. Cabernet Sauvignon dominates on the left bank, Merlot on the right bank. But why is that? It's easy to say Cabernet Sauvignon likes gravel better, which occurs a lot on the left bank, and Merlot likes clay better, which occurs on the right bank. But let's go deeper. Why is that? Well, if you look at the viticultural characteristics of the Cabernet Sauvignon grape, it is a late budding and late ripening grape. What does that mean? It means that the buds, the small buds on the shoots, they bud late. So probably after spring frost can happen, or a lot of times. Therefore, it doesn't need the protection of clay. It can have a little bit more loose soil, like gravel. Next to that, it's a late ripening variety, which means it has a long growing season. So it needs a long time to develop everything we want it to have in terms of flavor, compounds, complexity, and to get rid of the unwanted aromas. Because to develop all this fruit, but also especially in Europe's countries, this earthy graphite character, and without it becoming very green, because of the pyrazines that are in the Cabernet family, which are, for example, like the tomato leaf and green bell pepper, which is nice, but only in a very small amount. And if you let it develop and ripen longer, it turns into this aromatic herbal quality like sage. And maybe a touch of this green bell pepper, but dark and very pleasant to have. And why does it like gravel then? Well, because gravel, first of all, retains heat because it's stones, small little stones. It has a bigger thermal mass than, for example, sand. And thermal mass means it retains heat better. So this makes sure that, just like the water, it retains heat longer than the rest of the land mass and the vines. So during the night, the gravel still has a little bit of warmth, which gives it off to the vines, so it can keep ripening even during the night, or at least not ripen as little otherwise. Next to that, it is a very well draining soil. As you know, gravel is very loose, so all the water goes through. This is nice because I always compare this to humans. Of course, you want someone fed, you want someone to eat, you want someone to drink, but you don't want them lazy. You don't want them to sit back and to get food in their mouth and water in their mouth. You want them to work for it. You want this person to work out in the gym so they become stronger. And what happens in the gym? It's hard, it's difficult, you strain your muscles, but because of that you get stronger afterwards. Same with grapes and same with vines. If you just give them everything they want, they grow everything, but they don't necessarily focus on reproduction because they aren't stressed, they aren't in danger. When a grape or when a vine is in danger, they want to reproduce because they are afraid they're going to die, so they create grapes, good grapes. If they think, I'm going to survive for 20, 30, 40, 50 more years, they don't care. They're going to grow shoots and leaves and just get as much photosynthesis as possible, but then you get this very weak, diluted grapes. So, what do you want? You want the vines to be under stress and not have as much water as they want. So they're a little bit scared and they start focusing on the grape. And then that's when a lot of the energy gets focused towards sugar accumulation, towards aroma development. And the draining of the soils is really important for this. Hence, gravel is important. Why is then Merlot better on clay? Merlot is an early budding and early ripening variety. So Cabernet Sauvignon buds late, which means it goes past a lot of the cold of the spring and the winter. But Merlot buds early, which means it can still be waking up, let's say, during the cold, during frost. Well, clay gives a kind of a protection to that. Because it's so dense, it can still protect the vine better. It can still protect the vine better from all the cold and the frost. And it's a lot, and it retains water better. Because it's such an easy soil to grow in, it keeps water better, it stays cool as well. With the ripening, because it's an early ripening grape, the Merlot doesn't need as much warmth as possible and as much time to develop all the complexities of the aromas and sugar. Hence, this poor soil is not necessary. It can have this bigger or this richer soil because it will ripen anyway. So now that we understand the soils and the grape varieties better and why they work, let's talk about the region and the smaller appellations, because it's very important to understand these appellations aren't created by humans. I mean, of course they are, but in the end the geology and the soils and the microclimates is why humans created those appellations. So it's actually the other way around. Don't study the soils as part of an appellation. Study that the appellations became so because of the geology, and that's why wines are different. So let's look at it in terms of a map. The left bank is west of the Gironde and the Garonne. This is where Cabernet Sauvignon dominates. This is the Médoc mostly, and this is what I talked about with the Dutch draining. The Médoc is the biggest part which the Dutch drained, which gives a lot of this gravel soil, which was underwater before. And this is also why Cabernet Sauvignon dominates in the Médoc. Within the left bank you have the Médoc. Within the Médoc you have the Haut Médoc and the Bas Médoc, which we now basically call Médoc. So the Haut Médoc is more south, while the Médoc itself is a little bit of the northern part on the left bank. And the Haut Médoc is where it's really happening, because the Bas Médoc is very close to the sea. It has a lot of clay, it's very flat, so it is very easy, lighter, accessible wines, but the quality is in the Haut Médoc. Within the Haut Médoc, from north to south, there's Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, Saint-Julien, Margaux, and then a little bit on the west is Listrac and Moulis Médoc, which are smaller appellations. Then if you go further south, there is Grave, and a big part of Grave is Pessac-Léognan, which we'll talk about later as well. And each of these areas are different because of gravel depth, clay additions in the soil, drainage, distance from the Gironde estuary, and of course the exposure of vineyards to the sun. Let's start with Saint-Estèphe. It's the northernmost appellation within the Haut Médoc, where it's a little bit downstream, so there's a little bit more clay as well in the soil, but mixed in with mostly gravel. Of course, Cabernet Sauvignon dominates, but Merlot plays a little bit of a bigger part in the blend than anywhere else in the Haut Médoc. What happens with the wines? The wines here are firm, structured, austere when they're young, so these do need a little bit of age, and they can often age exceptionally. Pauillac, a little bit south, is basically the epitome of quality Bordeaux that we know of, because it is very deep gravel ridges, so Cabernet Sauvignon has everything it needs to be optimal in terms of its quality due to the ripening and the drainage. This is where 3 of the top chateaux are located, which we'll talk about later. And no other commune has more growths, has more top chateau than this commune. Moving on down south to Saint-Julien, it borders Pauillac very closely, and people talk about Saint-Julien as the most consistent commune. It's always good. It has the highest concentration of top chateau. So where the other communes, they'll also have a lot of lower tier producers. Saint-Julien almost has only top producers. It's not big, but they have a lot of top producers relatively. Now Margaux, so more south. This is where the topsoil gets very thin. It's a little bit warmer, it's a little bit more southern. This gives the wine very elegant, light and fragrant style. Because this topsoil is very thin and shallow, it doesn't retain heat quite the same. So it doesn't really create power because it doesn't ripen as long and as good as in northern communes. But it does keep this elegant, silky aroma. It stops a little bit short of the powerful wines, but it still stays in this elegant floral wine. And now, more south, we go to Pessac-Léognan. Pessac-Léognan is part of Graves, which is the birthplace of good Bordeaux. Because before the Medoc was drained, before everyone else was selling a lot of wine, Graves was the top of the top. There have been records back to 1400 where top positions like the King of England drank Pessac-Léognan, drank Haut-Brion even. And Gravel dominates. But there's one more thing, they also produce white wine here. Let's go to the right bank. We cross the Dordogne River, and this is where everything changes. There's more clay, more limestone, more elevation, and also therefore more Merlot. Cabernet Sauvignon becomes secondary, sometimes even tertiary in the blends. Not because it cannot grow, it can grow definitely, but Merlot performs way better. And this is crucial to understand. Cabernet Sauvignon can definitely grow, it can definitely be produced as a wine, but Merlot just simply is better adapted to the geology here. Within the right bank we have Saint-Emilion, Pomerol, there is Canon Fronsac and Fronsac, we have the satellite appellations, we have Lalande Pomerol and satellite appellations of Saint-Emilion, so Montagne, Lussac, Pousigny and Saint-Georges. And then even east of Saint-Emilion there is Castillon and Côte-de-Franc. Within the right bank, the most important, arguably, appellations are Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. Saint-Emilion is one of the Bordeaux's oldest wine towns, and when you visit you'll see it is beautiful. There's Roman origins, it's high up on a plateau. It even, if I remember correctly, it started out because a monk, Saint Emilion, was chilling out here in this cave, which is underneath the city basically, in this limestone cave I think. And people started to visit him for advice, and eventually a community started to grow around this cave of him, and this is how the town was born. I think the cave is still there to see. And because of this, it's a UNESCO heritage, a World Heritage site as well. And I already mentioned the limestone. Well, this is a limestone plateau. It's very high elevated with limestone, and there's a couple of parts within Saint-Emilion you need to remember. On top there's the limestone plateau. Then down the slopes, the Côte, it's a little bit more clay mixed in with the limestone. And even more down the slope, the Pied de Côte, the foot of the slopes, there's more clay and less limestone mixed in. And behind the town, so up on the plateau, behind the town of Saint-Emilion, there's the sandy plains. So even within Saint-Emilion, there's a huge difference in soil geology, which also explains why Merlot is not the only grape that grows a lot here. Also Cabernet Franc. Next to that, more west, we have Pomerol, which is a small little appellation which is divided from Fronsac, which I mentioned before, by the Isle River. And Pomerol is tiny. It doesn't have any classifications like Saint-Emilion on their left bank, but still they produce some of the world's most expensive wines. Why? Because they have this intensely beautiful blue clay soil, which creates very high quality in the wines. They even have this big concentration of, I think, 200 hectares of blue clay, which they call the boutonnière, the belly button. And Chateau Petrus, the most expensive and famous chateau from Pomerol, is located right in the middle of it. Now that we have had a small indication of all the appellations, let's finally discuss why Bordeaux is so well known. Of course, it's all about the quality of the wines that have been made throughout centuries of the winemaking history here. But the classification has made sure it stood through time, always. It went from a hype to a well-known wine place. And that was because in 1855, important year to remember, Napoleon was in charge of France, and he ordered the Chamber of Commerce to create some kind of classification of the best wines for Bordeaux. This is because there was this universal worldly exposition, the Exposition Universelle in Paris, and they wanted to show the best of the best wines available in France. So what they did is they created the Chamber of Commerce together with the Court of Brokers, of courtiers, which are the people who buy from the chateau, bottle it, and sell it to the market basically. They created this system where they looked at the secondary market value, so the selling prices of the wines, and the chateau with the highest prices would become higher classified. So instead of a professional tasting panel like it's done often these days, they made sure the classification was created basically by their popularity and by what people thought of the quality. Because if it's better quality, people will buy it more, and people will pay more for it. Basic economics, supply and demand. Hence the 1855 classification was born with 5 different levels: Premier Cru, Deuxième Cru, Troisième Cru, and also on until 5: first, second, third, fourth, fifth growth wines. Back then in total I think there were 61, now it's 58, due to all the splits and most of all the merging of several chateaux. Funny enough, everything stayed the same. All the chateaux stayed in their classification because it was a classification from that time. It's not a continuous ranking. It's always been the same, except one: Mouton Rothschild. Mouton Rothschild was classified as a second growth of Pauillac, but during the 20th century, the owner, Baron Philippe de Rothschild, knew that Mouton Rothschild was higher level, was higher quality, and they showed throughout the 20th century that it was consistently very high quality. He made sure to lobby a lot to make sure politics got warmed up to the idea of Mouton Rothschild being a first growth. He did a lot of investing in the chateau, and eventually in 1973 Mouton Rothschild was promoted from second to the first growth, and thus expanding the first growth chateau from 4 to 5. Now the most important chateau to remember for the classification are the 5 first growths. Which chateau has classified first growth in Saint-Estèphe? Correct, there is none. Moving on to Pauillac, which first growths are classified there? 3. There is Mouton Rothschild, which we discussed has been promoted later on, Lafite Rothschild, and Chateau Latour. Moving on to Saint-Julien, nothing. Moving on to Margaux, there's 1, Chateau Margaux, and the only exception outside of the Médoc is Chateau Haut-Brion from Pessac-Léognan. If I had to describe all of their styles in a couple of words, I would say Mouton Rothschild is the rich, expressive, extravagant style. It's the most rich and ripe style. We have Lafite Rothschild, which is the most balanced and classic style. It's perfectly technically produced, not too powerful, not too light, not too aromatic, but it's right in between. Let's say he's the aristocrat, where the Mouton Rothschild is the rebel. Moving on to Chateau Latour. Chateau Latour is the most powerful but austere structured. Chateau Latour is the one of the five which you want to keep the longest before you drink it, to soften out the structure and to develop all the aromas in the bottle. Next to that, Chateau Margaux, just like the Margaux appellation commune, floral, elegant, fragrant, soft, the poet. And moving on to the south, Pestre-Gléonard, Haut-Brion is the wise elder. It is structured, fresh, earthy, and it has this typical smoky character to it. And you really taste, you notice that this is a chateau which has been around the longest. Very interesting. And then producers on the right bank, which you have to know, we have Pomerol, which is Petrus, which is the top of the top, this powerful blue clay style. And you have Le Pin, which is a very small producer, which is a beautiful wine as well, and very hard to get, very hard to get. Saint-Emilion also has a classification, where this classification is meant to be updated every 10 years. Now, because of this, there has been a lot of critique towards the classification. So last time it was updated, 2022, a couple of chateaux stepped out. Let's discuss the levels first. In Saint-Emilion, you have the Grand Cru. The Grand Cru is just an appellation. Grand Cru is not a quality indication. Everyone can produce Saint-Emilion Grand Cru. Moving on to Saint-Emilion Grand Cru Classé. This is the most basic classification. This is the most basic classification. And there's like hundreds of them. It's a lot. Then we move on to Premier Grand Cru Classé. This is where the high quality chateaux are. So you have Premier Grand Cru Classé B and Premier Grand Cru Classé A. So in terms of Burgundy levels, let's say we have here Premier Cru and Grand Cru. But here chateaux are classified, not the vineyards, which is very important to understand. Premier Grand Cru Classé B has, I think, around 14. There is Chateau Beau Séjour, Chateau Beau Séjour Bécotte, Canon, Canon Gafflière. You have Larcis Ducasse, Troplong Mondot, La Mondotte, Clos Fortet. There is Pavie Mecoin, Trottevillaille, Valandreau. And I'm thinking I'm forgetting one. Let me know in the comments if you remember what the other one is. And then Premier Grand Cru Classé A, there's two. You have Chateau Pavie and Chateau Figeac, which was recently promoted in 2022 to level A. Now there were a couple who stepped out. You have Chateau Angelus, which was a Premier Grand Cru Classé A. Chateau Cheval Blanc, which was a Premier Grand Cru Classé A. And Chateau La Gaffelière, which was a B level Premier Grand Cru Classé. These are the most important producers to know. Now that we have had a overall video of the Bordeaux, let me know if you want to see a more in-depth video explaining every region or appellation per part, and if we want to go more in depth about Sauternes, sweet wine, or the dry white wines of Bordeaux as well. Thank you very much for tuning in again with Sommelier in Progress, and stay curious and keep studying.